In this video, we are going to talk about the time period post-Civil War known as Reconstruction. So this is obviously right after the Civil War, and the title Reconstruction is literally meaning the country is going to be rebuilt into something different, a country without the institution of slavery. And so let's think about what happens, and the Civil War itself ends in 1865. So what was the reality like in 1865, right? The war itself was 4 years long, from 1861 to 1865. And there are specifically 3 important constitutional amendments that are passed during this time period of Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, which was when all African Americans were freed from slavery. 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship rights to the newly freed slaves, and the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. Now notice I say Black men, that's because women were not included until 1920 in the 19th Amendment, which we will talk about in future lectures. But one thing I do highlight too is that it's an easy way to remember these amendments is the term free citizens vote. Okay, and I have that broken out, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Now, the reality of this time period also goes into what freedom was to the newly freed slaves and what freedom was to the whites, specifically in the South, really, but even in the North also, okay? And so the newly freed slaves, they saw freedom as wanting things like to be able to hold open meetings without a white person present, to be able to have church and hold church, to be able to have dogs and own guns and drink liquor, which was not afforded to them in many of these former Confederate states. They didn't have that ability to do that, okay? The other thing that's important is that family becomes more of the center. In some of the Confederate states and in some of the plantations, they weren't allowed to marry. Okay, so marriage becomes the center. Unfortunately, a lot of Black families begin to take on this patriarchal role that they see, and so a lot of Black women actually lose status a little bit in this new type of center for family. And so we do see a lot of new Black churches that pop up specifically in the South. And one very important thing that becomes important to newly freed slaves is education. And that's something that they really take advantage of. The freedmen schools that we're going to talk about here in just a moment, extremely important. Remember that, even teaching a slave how to read and write in some of these former Confederate states was illegal. You couldn't do that, okay? Because if they learned to read and write, they could organize and they could rise up, and so this wasn't permitted. So for a lot of African Americans, this becomes a very important aspect of being free. This is an image of a church. So this is a new Black church that pops up during this time period. Okay, just kind of give you an image of that. So just like I mentioned before, one of the most significant things that happens during Reconstruction is that something called the Freedmen's Bureau is created. Okay, it only lasts 5 years, but it does some very significant things. Okay, it establishes school, it gives aid like healthcare and stuff like that to the poor and to the aged. And it does settle disputes between whites and Blacks. That's kind of what this image here is depicting, settling any kind of disputes between them. Also to get equal treatment in courts. And I will argue, though, that the most significant part of the Freedmen's Bureau and the most successful part was in education and healthcare. There was also an aspect of it that was supposed to give land reform, and they were hoping that newly freed slaves would also get some land and gain some land, but this never came to fruition. The reality was that even the Republicans in the North who supported the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment thought it was a step too far to give African Americans land. Okay, as hard as that is to swallow, that was the real reality of it. So this is an image of a freedmen's school, and it is important to note that there were white and Black people that served in these Freedmen Bureau schools. There are many free Blacks that were in the North that came down to the Freedmen Bureau schools and were a part of this. And I also want to point out something significant. In Texas was a former Confederate state, so this is significant as well. Public schools were not a thing in the South until the freedmen's schools existed. If you were in the South and you wanted to be educated, you had to come from a wealthy family that could afford tutors. Okay, because they didn't have public school in the South until post-Civil War. So not only does the Freedmen Bureau educate African Americans, in the South, newly freed slaves, it also educates poor whites. So significant, in many different aspects. This is another image of Freedmen Bureau. They're getting aid and help, health care, and some monetary things. Here's an actual photograph of a freedmen's school in South Carolina. Now, what happens since African Americans do not get land? How are they going, how are they going to, exist, and how are they going to thrive? And unfortunately, there was a system that was created known as sharecropping. And this system actually exists well into the 1960s, possibly even the 1970s. Remnants of it really still existent today, okay? So what happened is that families were basically given like a small plot of land on a large plantation. Many, if not most, of the people who are using the sharecropping system actually were on the same plantation that they were a slave on. That does happen quite a bit. Just to kind of give you a visual on this, this is where the sharecropping, areas existed. The heavier concentration, the darker areas, the more sharecropping existed here. Texas, East Texas, so you can see that here. West Texas at this time, not really built up. This doesn't really happen until post-Civil War, and arguably even, with the invention of the windmill and other things that really exist in Texas a little later on. So Texas, population-wise, is really just in the main area of Texas. And to kind of give you an idea, this is an actual plantation in South Carolina called the Burro Plantation. This is before or during, or actually really right before the Civil War, and this is afterwards, okay? And so you can see that they have houses and things like this, but they're literally on the same plantation that they existed in. There's a good video just below here on the sharecropping system, but what essentially happened in the sharecropping system was that they would get a plot of land, and they would work that plot of land. And actually, let me go back a slide here, a couple slides. But basically, they would give that sharecropping, whatever the money was left over, or the harvest was from that time, and they would have to give that, a portion of it, to the plantation owner. Okay, the reality of this with the plantation owner is that the plantation owners, would not be honest about it most of the time, okay? And a lot of these plantation owners own plantation stores in which they literally would make money, plantation money. And the only way that you could buy tools to be able to, work the land or anything was to buy it at this plantation store. And so you got further and further into debt with the plantation, and it ends up being this cycle that they can never get out of. A lot of people call this debt slavery. Okay, and so like I mentioned, the video below goes into quite a bit of detail about this. Now, Reconstruction plans themselves, what happened post-Civil War, the person that takes over after Lincoln is assassinated, the vice president, was a man named Andrew Johnson. There's really no better way for me to say this other than the man was very deeply racist. Okay, he becomes Lincoln's president vice president in his second term, and he's from Tennessee. He's a unionist. He didn't believe in separating from the Union, but he was definitely favored white Southerners, okay, and again, deeply racist. And Lincoln does this really because Lincoln wanted to bring the country back together again. In his second inaugural address, he literally said, "Malice towards none." So this was very important for him to bring in somebody like this. Unfortunately, he's assassinated. And so for 2 years, Reconstruction was not going well. Okay, and so I'll talk about specifically or something called the Black Codes that existed during this time. Essentially, white Confederate government, former Confederate officers got right back into power. and found ways to control African Americans. So it didn't look much different than before the Civil War. So because of this, the radical Republicans take over. So in 1867, for the rest of Reconstruction, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the radical Republicans Congress literally take control of Reconstruction, okay? So when this happens, this is when you see the 14th and 15th Amendment passed. They support black rights, and they do something very significant, and I'll show you a map of this here in just a moment, but they place the military districts in the South. So in the South, what happens with this is they literally control and make sure that African American rights are protected. Okay. And really the unfortunate part of Reconstruction, in radical Reconstruction, was the end of it. Okay. And so we'll talk about in a little bit why that happened. But let's talk about that time period, those 2 years in which Andrew Johnson, was controlling Reconstruction. Okay. So one of the things and significant things that happens is the establishment of something called black codes. And even Texas had its own black codes. Okay. And I'll put a link here as well so you can see the actual Texas black codes if you're interested in this. But essentially, this puts them right back into slavery, really. Every Confederate, former Confederate, state has their own set of black codes. So, and many of them, they did give them the right to marry. Some allowed them to own property, and some allowed them to access courts. Most did not. Okay, most did not do this. They basically mostly did not allow them to testify against whites, serve in juries, definitely did not allow them to vote. Okay, it made them sign these labor contracts. Essentially, there was something called vagrancy laws, and if they were found not working on a plantation, they were literally arrested and placed in jail. Okay, and guess what? The one clause in the 13th Amendment says that you can institute slavery. There's a clause in the 13th Amendment that literally says that you can't have slavery unless someone's incarcerated. Okay, so that was just a way to put them right back into slavery. That's where the chain gangs came from and things like this. So if you were a newly freed black in the South and you were under these black codes, you had to work on a plantation. And of course, we know that sharecropping existed. There was really no way for them really to get out of this cycle of poverty. And like I mentioned before, this only lasts 2 years. This is something that's a little misunderstood. Black codes do not last the entire time during Reconstruction. They end when the radical Reconstructionists come in. There's an amendment known as the 14th Amendment that gave them citizenship rights that essentially wipes out the black codes. Okay, so here's a visual of the military districts. And these exist until 1877, until the end of radical Reconstruction. You can see Texas itself is in District 5. Okay, so let's talk again about Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson is actually the first president in the United States that becomes impeached. Now I want to back up for just a minute. Impeachment does not mean that they're kicked out of office. It's kind of like a grand jury charge in a criminal court where there's enough evidence that is found for them to stand trial. That's what an impeachment is. Okay, so they do that in the House of Representatives. They look at it and put forth the articles of impeachment. Is there enough evidence for them to be kicked out of office? So he was found that there wasn't enough evidence to kick him out of office. It goes to the Senate, and he almost gets kicked out of office. He loses it, or he wins it really by 1 vote. Okay, and what he did was he violated something known as the Tenure of Office Act, and this was put in place by the radical Reconstructionists in 1867 because Johnson, when he came in and became president, he essentially got rid of everybody that Lincoln had put into place that would have supported black rights. Okay, and so they passed this law in order to stop him from doing this. And so, like I mentioned before, he stays in office just by 1 vote, but of course he's not even, he doesn't win the next election. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union commander, becomes the next president. Okay. So with these new 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, one thing that we see happen during radical Reconstruction, when black rights are upheld and newly freed slaves are allowed to vote, is we see a significant number of African Americans that become office holders. And they become office holders not just at a national level. There were senators and there were House of Representatives members that were Black, but now you also see them at the city level, municipal level, at the state level. In the South Carolina state Senate or state Congress, state legislature, I should really say, in South Carolina, there were actually more Black office holders than there were white during radical Reconstruction. And this kind of gives you a little bit of numbers there. And just like I mentioned before, they served at the local and state level, okay? Even with these protections, though, we do have something that begins, and this really begins almost immediately after Reconstruction in 1865, was we see something known as, which we refer to as the Reign of Terror during this time. And what happens is that in the KKK itself, which is the most well-known white supremacy group even today that still exists, is that, and it was formed by a former Confederate officer actually as kind of like a joke, ironically, but then it becomes a very large, organization that literally terrorizes not only newly freed Blacks, but also anybody supporting African American rights. And that a lot of Freedmen Bureau people that worked in the freedmen schools were targeted and attacked and killed. Okay, there were other organizations too. Like one of the most well known was the Knights of the White Camellia, another white supremacy group. But the difference is that when Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and when the radical Reconstructionists take over, there are enforcement acts. They're known as the KKK Acts of 1867 and 1868 that literally suppresses these groups, and completely, also ironically, they can almost completely suppress these. And we see the KKK almost completely go away after this is gone. There are two more major resurgences that happened in the 1900s that caused the KKK to rise. And that was, which we will talk about, the Great Migration of African Americans, really mainly during the World Wars, when factory jobs open up in the North, and we see a huge number of KKK organizations grow, sadly, in the North, and then also during the Civil Rights era, which we will also talk about. Okay, and there was in the 2000s another resurgency of the KKK, and that was due to Obama's election in 2008, which is usually very surprising to many students. Okay, so if Reconstruction was so good and there were Black office holders and things were looking much better for African Americans, they were protected, then why did Reconstruction end? Why did these protections go away, right? There are a few things that happen in the United States that causes people in the North, Republicans in the North, to start to lose interest in taking care of African Americans and rights and protections, okay? There were, even during Grant's administration, quite a bit of corruption that was happening at a government level. There was something known as the whiskey, there was like a whiskey corruption scandal, whiskey ring. There was a Credit Mobilier scandal that happens during Grant's administration. Now, Grant is not tied to this, but he has a lot of cabinet members that are. And a lot of people said, oh, this is because there are Black people in office, which is completely crazy because there were no Black office holders that were involved in any of these corruption rings, right? But that's what they used to say that, okay? And because of a lot of these things happening, the Democrats take over the House of Representatives, which scares a lot of Republicans, okay? There's also like an economic recession in 1873. Really, that's why the Democrats won, was because of the recession happened in 1873. The other two really big things that happen is the two staunchest advocates for Black rights that were radical Reconstructionists, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, die. Okay, and so when they both die, also, their staunchest supporters go away as well. And I just mentioned this about the economic panic that happens. Okay, so what happens? When does it finally happen? And so in 1876, a new election, the Democrats won both the House and the Senate. And so that means that the Republicans were going to lose control of all the branches, both the executive and legislative branches, okay? And so, but the presidential election came off in a tie. So what happens, according to the Constitution, when there is a tie, and there's no majority of electoral votes, is that it goes to the House of Representatives. Okay, and so the Republicans make a deal with the Democrats. They said, we will vote for your guy, or we want you to vote for our guy, who was Rutherford B. Hayes, even though Tilden actually probably would have won because he actually had more electoral votes. But they said, we'll do that, and in return, we will end Reconstruction. So that's what happens. The military districts pull out, the protections for African Americans end, and so literally it was a political reason why the protections for African Americans end and Reconstruction ends in the United States, okay? So what happens with this? I will tell you that there are, it's not all like a very negative. I know that it sounds horrible in a lot of aspects, but even with the end of Reconstruction, there is a large Black middle class that really flourishes, even after Reconstruction. Even though African Americans, office holders do dwindle from this, we do see a large number of middle class that grows in this. Okay, a large middle class because segregation begins to occur during this time period, and so African Americans were serving their own communities. So you had African American doctors and lawyers, and mortuary people and all types of things and so we do see this. Okay, we also see some groups begin to form in order to organize for African American rights, like the National Association of Colored Women. And later on in our next couple lectures, we're going to talk about the NAACP that forms, W.E. Du Bois and other people that begin to rise up. And even though they don't really make any significant headway until the civil rights era, those do exist and they begin to form. Okay. But one thing we do see absolutely is the disenfranchisement of African American males in voting. So the complete elimination of African American voting. I think the number of African Americans that were voting during Reconstruction was somewhere up to 80%. So eligible African American men who could vote in 1880 was about 80% of them were voting. Okay, so a lot of them were voting. By 1940, and this includes women too at this point, eligible voters, African American voters, was at 3%. Okay, and so why is that? Why did they technically have it, a law that said, the 15th Amendment and then the 19th Amendment that said they could vote, but why was nobody voting, right? Why were African Americans not voting? And so there were a few things. Number one, there was a poll tax. So, and this is eventually overturned later on by a constitutional amendment, but a poll tax essentially said in order for you to vote, you have to pay a tax. And a lot of African Americans couldn't afford that. Okay. A lot of them were in poverty. And so not only did that disenfranchise poor Blacks, that also disenfranchised poor whites. Okay. Another thing that happens is literacy tests. And I want to say that, you might look at this and say, well, what's a big deal with that? Well, I will tell you that these literacy tests were conducted by white voting people. So they would sit behind there and they were the ones to judge whether somebody was literate. There were people that were doctors, lawyers, teachers, Black teachers that could not pass these literacy tests, okay, because these literacy tests were crazy. If you want to see something super interesting, you should take a look at the Louisiana literacy test. It's kind of interesting, what happens with that. There was also something called a grandfather clause. Now, this doesn't last very long, but it essentially said, in some states, they said, you can only vote if your grandfather could vote. Well, who does that eliminate? Obviously, anybody who is Black. So there were lots of things like this, okay? And like I mentioned before, only 3% of adult Blacks in the South were registered to vote by 1940. Okay, there were also laws of segregation, like I mentioned before, and we'll talk about this in more detail a little bit later on. But essentially, it becomes the law of the land in 1896 when there was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which a guy named Plessy, who was actually mostly white, he was a very small percentage. I mean, he could definitely pass off as white, challenged this law and was arrested, and this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the court ruled, the very racist court, in an 8-1 ruling, said that states could make laws that segregated blacks and whites as long as the facilities were separate but equal. We know they weren't equal, okay? And it's not overturned until 1954, and we'll get into more depth about that and that process a little bit later on. We also see, even though the KKK was somewhat suppressed at this point, we see a rise of lynchings, okay? So some of these lynchings were done in secret, some were done on display, and essentially the definition of a lynching is when vigilante justice, I will say that in air quotes, is taken on people that are accused of something, okay? And so basically, if a black male, and most of the time it was because black males were falsely accused of either sexual assault or rape on a white woman, that was most of the lynching cases, they would literally be pulled from the jail and they would be taken and they would be lynched. You know, either they were hanged or they were killed, because it doesn't have to be a hanging in order for it to be considered a lynching. Okay, now you might remember, and lynchings still occur, right? And definitely one of the most famous cases was in the 1950s, was the Emmett Till case. And like I mentioned, a lot of victims, most victims were wrongly accused of raping white women. And I will tell you wrongly accused because I know of not one case that I've ever learned about in which the black man actually sexually assaulted or raped the white woman. Okay, this was either made up by the woman because she had sexual relations with the man and didn't want anybody to know, or they simply just targeted the black male and used that as a reason. One of the most staunch advocates against this is a woman that we'll talk about more too, is Ida B. Wells. Very amazing woman. She becomes a crusader for African American rights. She also becomes one of the co-founders of the NAACP, which is the longest living civil rights organization on earth. Okay, and so we'll talk more about her a little bit later. Okay, so but to summarize exactly what happens, the Civil War ends, Reconstruction time period. African Americans did enjoy some freedoms, and federal, as long as those federal protections were in post, 1867 to 1877. But we also know that laws of disenfranchisement, segregation occur post 1877, which doesn't get overturned and until beginning in the 1950s, and there was segregation all the way through the 1970s, even the early 80s in the South in some places. Okay. Anyway, that kind of summarizes this. I hope you have a great day.